Thank you all. It's a very daunting responsibility to know you're the last who separates the audience from a duly needed pause. So, when the digital initially developed, something troubling emerged, the notion that the digital world was somewhat analogous to a space. If you think a little bit, there is nothing evident why did we almost immediately began to compare the electronic world to a space. This can be traced as early as the first representation of what was to become the internet in cyberpunk literature. Think of authors like Gibson or Stephenson, and very often with a metaphor that the metaverse or other names was like a gleaming, scintillating, Las Vegas-like space. The spatial character was further reinforced when William Mitchell, in his mid-1990s book, City of Bits, also advocated architects to become the designers of the virtual world. What is striking is that for a time, the electronic space was reassuringly seen as separate from the physical space. And Mitchell is once again typical. He advocated in some ways, designers to go from bricks to atoms. It created at the time quite a polemics with Frampton. Video games also reflected the state of affairs. They were indeed conceived as spaces, but spaces distinct from physical reality, spaces having often a fantastic quality. And hence the recurring accusation made against them that they constituted a dangerous and addictive diversion from the real world. So the past decade or so has seen a kind of complete break from this conception. In many cases, the physical and the digital are not separate, but actually intimately linked. So this will be really the subject of my talk. I took seriously the term reality. What is the reality we live in today? The electronic contents cannot be simply considered as a kind of fourth dimension perpendicular to the three others, a little bit alike time. For there is an imbrication of the physical and the digital, which has led very often to the use of notions such as augmented reality. Again, the difference with the relation between space and time is quite noticeable. Time does not augment space. It develops in another direction, even if we've known since Einstein that the relation is actually far more complex. So not all electronic contents are impacted, but so many of them that one can speak actually of a kind of spatial turn of the digital. Somebody mentioned Soja before me, to transpose the late Edward Soja expression. So two phenomena have played a role in this evolution, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to start by quite evident things, but which still fascinate me. The first is geolocation, a consequence of GPS. It's still fairly recent, but it has become almost invisible. The blue dot on our smartphone screens seems absolutely self-evident. And how not to think of the remark made by the Silicon Valley guru Mark Weiser in 1991 in his famous article, The Computer for the 21st Century. I quote, "The most profound technologies are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they're undistinguishable from it." And actually, we've become totally accustomed to geolocation as if it was an absolutely natural thing that has always been with us. Another way to think of that would be to say that the GPS is actually the true infrastructure of our contemporary digitally augmented world. Infrastructure are precisely technological systems that disappear, and Benjamin Bratton's is often close to this intuition in his attempt to theorize the layered reality which merges atoms and bits through the notion of stack. So, as an historian, for me, geolocation is something truly revolutionary. Very often things we attribute to the digital are actually about geolocation. We're probably the first civilization to know, often in real time, where billions of objects and people are. And actually, you could say that one of the great effects of the telecommunication revolution was from the start to enable to know where are people and things. For example, the railway revolution was a revolution because of the telegraph, and the telegraph allowed to know where were the trains. So we're seeing something at a much larger scale. And many of the platforms, for example, that have transformed our everyday life, beginning with Uber, would not be possible without geolocation. Geolocated and connected objects is, basically are transforming very deeply our reality. And there again, they're invisible. We don't see them usually except on sites like those who map month after month, the connected object on the planet. They're pretty much beginning to cover the entire planet. So that was my first phenomenon, geolocation. Second phenomenon, which has been mentioned also before, if GPS and geolocation have provided the infrastructure, the true engine of this evolution, this kind of hybridization of atoms and bits, has to do with a rising consciousness that cities play a determining role in the evolution of our world. Who hasn't heard the almost ritual statement in 2050, 68%, it varies usually between 65 and 75% of the world population will be living in cities. We live for sure in an urbanized world, and despite the critique of theorists like my colleague Neil Brenner, who prefer to evoke a phenomenon of planetary urbanization following the French urban sociologist Henri Lefebvre, this statement is typical of the new importance of cities. What is also very typical is the success of books like Harvard economist Edward Glaeser. I really like the title, Triumph of the City, How Our Greatest Invention Makes Us Richer, Smarter, Greener, Healthier, and Happier. Only an American could come with such a subtitle. It's quite revealing. So leaving aside the ideology, because there is of course a ton of ideology behind the statement, two things are sure. Cities have been instrumental in globalization, and they are the greatest producer of data. Big data is mostly urban data. And the success of Carlo Radi's Sensible Lab at MIT is linked to the fact that he was among the first research program to identify this phenomenon. And he was actually the first to tap into the vast amount of information generated by cell phone location. And here an image of his now historic real-time Rome project in which the lab tracked the movement of the public gathering for a concert by Madonna in Rome. I like especially the concert by Madonna. So the smart city dynamics is actually a direct consequence of this. Most of the smart technologies we're talking about today are actually based on geolocation and is used to gather data. Equally telling, probably for me, of this kind of conjunction is the revolution in urban mapping that is taking place under our eyes. This is something I've been working for a while, is how the new maps of the digital age are perhaps the most emblematic document until now of the hybridization between atoms and bits. The first thing to note is that what we call maps today is very different from what maps used to mean. The map is today in continuity with all sorts of other media. The map has become indifferent to a number of traditional distinctions. For example, there is no clear difference today in many cases between mapping and monitoring. And the dream of the control room that very often accompanies the smart city movement actually completely merge mapping and monitoring, which is actually, there again, a very new thing. There is also a continuity today stronger than ever between mapping and simulation, to the point that you never can be entirely sure to what extent is it based on the collection of existing data, to what extent is it an extrapolation produced by models, etc., etc. Above all, and this is a kind of salute to our friend Mario, there is the classic dichotomy between database and representation, which dominated cartography for a very long time. Is the map basically a database transformed into a picture, or is it actually a view from somewhere. This dichotomy no longer works. As some of you may remember, this is a dichotomy that emerged as early as the Renaissance, when Alberti really, instead of providing a map, this is not the map of Rome by Alberti, but it actually, Alberti provided a series of coordinates of points, remarkable points of the city of Rome, such as the location of major churches, etc. And around the same time, a few decades actually apart, Leonardo, as for him, invented rather the idea that the map was an image. Today, we no longer, and this is part of what Laura Kurgan, for example, has written. What do we see? Do we see images? Do we see database? What is appearing on a map? So what we call map, again, today is very different from what we used to consider. Maps also suggest, so country maps are really database, they're simulation, they're also database, they're all kinds of things. Maps tend to suggest something on which I'll return toward the end of this presentation, which is that the city is computable. And I'll return once again to the question of computation. What is striking now is that if we think what is the real today, the real has become a mix of atoms and bits. But it does not seem to have impacted to the same degree architecture than it has urban planning. It's very striking how designers are, for example, relatively absent from the smart city movement. It's mostly an engineer, political scientist, etc. conversation and tech conversation. So in such a context, the question for me is, what should designer do? How to take really seriously the hybridization of atoms and bits beyond invoking it as a perfectly natural condition. So since I'm the last, let me reveal what I'm going to argue so that I can stop whenever I want. I'm going to argue that taking it seriously should actually lead architecture to rediscover its strong physical content. So I'm done. I should stop there, but now I'm going to ornate. First thing I'd like to note is when I said that designers are relatively absent, let's not exaggerate. They are absent from the debates about the smart city, which is worrisome, but the hybridization of atoms and bits is very present in design under other guise. For example, digital fabrication is clearly a process that is based on the hybridization of atoms and bits and really happens at the intersection of both worlds. And the notion of material computation, which has been popularized by researchers like Akim Menges or Jenny Sabin, is very typical of that. With the idea that there is no longer a kind of ontological distinction between matter and what is computable, which is actually, there again, a very profound epistemological change. It's thousands of culture that have been actually profoundly transformed. So what I would argue is that actually the example of digital fabrication enables to go further in the understanding of this process of hybridization. First thing to note is that actually before hybridizing, what happens first is a separation and then a rejoining. So the first thing to note is that information is first separated from the process of fabrication. We have a lot of things today about, the kind of material computation, the inseparable character of matter and computation. Actually, what has happened initially is something you take drastically apart in matter and information, and then you inject information into matter. And we talk a lot, by the way, today about designer as a new kind of craftsman, and there have been books like that in which Ruskin is reappearing, etc. I've argued that there is actually a formidable nostalgia, and that actually we've never been so far away from Ruskin. And that actually because we've completely taken apart matter and information initially. But then what takes place, and this is where it's complicated, is a kind of complex process of reassembling along many canals. Think of the diversity of algorithm, patterns, machines that enable this reassembling. The result is like a densely woven fabric. So I'm not a great fan of actor network theory, but I'm actually going to use one of the metaphors which I quite like from Latour in reassembling the social, in which basically he argues that there is no such thing as society as a stable entity. What there is what he called the thread of the social. That's to say the constant readjustment, reassembling, etc., of object, actors, etc., so that something that he calls the social comes to existence. And I would argue, and this is let me reassure you, this is the worst moment, it's going to get better after. I would argue that actually probably instead of thinking of augmented reality in the traditional sense of reality, something stable, we should rather think of it as something dynamic, as a process or a series of processes, not a static reality. Just like, by the way, the urban maps, digital maps, they do not depict a static reality. They depict something that is happening, unfolding, you name it, etc. And this might be actually one of the most fundamentally disconcerting features of today's reality, that it's no longer the immutable world architecture used to refer to. And, architecture was admirable in conveying this idea of order, the order of things, as Foucault would have said. Architecture is no longer in a completely stable world, but in a moving one, which is why before, if I'm correct now, the digital discrete took on, we had so many of these waves, Baroque movement, etc., etc. Behind that, of course, we have the rise of information and, of course, the notion that everything might be made of information and hence submitted to computation. And, material computation, if we take it there again literally, means that there is no material before it is computed in some way, so which is ontologically a bit disturbing. Of course, we know that architectural design was always driven by information, and Mario has shown that that after all, the 5 orders were like a code applying to matter. I've taken a French author, Mario, because we all know that we should be reluctant with all these Italians. But I would argue that this is reaching today a new level of intensity, and this intensity radically alters the underlying conception of the world. It's no longer a static order that is revealed, but a dynamic universe of operation. It's probably the biggest difference because for a very long time there was a kind of analogy between, the blobs and other eventful forms and the Baroque. In the Baroque era, architecture was indeed animated, in that respect, Descartes' world is fundamentally Baroque with its vortices, its complex assemblage of vortices. But reality was still based on fundamental, stable, underlying principles. Today, reality is like a series of circulation, and to use again a Latourian metaphor that I quite like, a net thrown on something, the profound nature of which we ignore. And I would say that, in some ways, augmented reality is like the net that we throw on the world to try to capture some of its feature. So this change, so now I've stayed in the elegant realm of ideas, but I think this is a change all the more powerful because, by the end, architecture, it's about building stuff. And, we tend to forget that in school sometimes, especially people like me, but it's a profession. So the epistemological changes of architecture are all the more powerful, usually, that they're articulated with professional change. So I'd like to say a few words on some of these changes, because they do happen. I'm always struck by the amount of literature we have of all kinds of fancy ideas about the digital, including me, as a producer of that kind of stuff, and how little we say about the profession. And the profession is actually knowing a very similar set of dislocation and reorganization. So to go quickly, just a couple of things. The first one, it's clear that traditional authorship, traditional structures are kind of exploding. All over the world, you hear things about open source architecture, network authorship. This is, for example, a Dutch fancy designer plus Marjan Coletti, robotically programmed arm, plus a third guy who designed the cloth which that covers the robotic arms, etc. All that. So who is the author? This is more and more complex. And people like Sanchez have explored with a plethora project object, ideas of also associating the public at large with design, etc. So we have that kind of explosion of traditional structure. And at the same time, a massive consolidation. A massive consolidation. Of course, we live in multi-author, but there are authors which are more authors than others, with a kind of winner takes all, like on Spotify, in terms of number of auditors who are really dominant in the industry. So there is something going on which is a little bit like the disassembling and reassembling of the social, or of that augmented reality also is about. To take another example, I spoke of consolidation. One of the consequences of the internet and the digital has been actually the rising size of most of the big architectural practice. That was a reasonably big practice in the 1950s, 1960s. I suppose you all know who is that bespectacled guy in the forefront. That's Le Corbusier, end of the 50s, early 60s. Now that's just the top brass of Zaha Hadid. And, I really took the top. And there is still that on that because I haven't updated that. But, and a 500 people practice is no longer seen as purely corporate. It's something relatively common. So once again, the structure of the profession are completely changing. So there is this kind of double process of disassembling, reassembling, of a kind of different configuration, in which you could argue also that probably the best way to describe the profession today is no longer using traditional structural metaphors, but rather these kind of threads of things that organize, etc., and produce what we call architecture. So that's all good. Now, what is striking, however, is that buildings are still buildings, and disappointingly buildings. I've heard a lot of things today about, how we're getting out of the modern, etc., but, most of the architects that make it, they still build in brick, concrete, steel, you name it, etc., and sometimes in relation with the good old-fashioned car that fascinated so much the moderns. So what about buildings? What about form and space? How could the hybridization between atoms and bits impact the near future? So those who know me know that I have some recurring obsession, especially with what I call materiality, of which in a moment. So the geometry of architecture has changed. As we've seen the smooth, now we've seen the spiky. Tomorrow we may see something else. So for sure, geometry has changed, forms have changed. But buildings are still extremely classical buildings, and I'm sure that Gilles is dreaming of building actually one of his buildings. So should we look beyond that for a true hybridization of architectural space with information? But what does it mean in practice? Can we go, for example, beyond the multiplication of screens that were used for experiments like the Seoul Digital Media City a decade ago? Carlo Ratti, to mention him again, has tried, for example, to have this kind of matrix-like ambience in a pavilion in Saragossa, but that was for an exhibition hall and definitely not for a living room. Should we play the card of interactive spaces? Like, for example, in the Morid Building Digital Art Museum in Tokyo. How about the Internet of Objects? Connected objects will for sure change the practice of spaces, interior spaces, but to which extent is it an architectural question? So my answer to all that is probably to say that the question is perhaps not so much to extend architecture along these lines than to mobilize it to express this new reality. I think what is fascinating with architecture is how archaic it is in some ways. Even with robots, I think architecture will still be a relatively archaic practice. The fact that we talk about primitive hot in something as hot as, new digital trends tell us something. So how do we express what's going on? And in a way, the disaggregation and reaggregation of reality that is taking place. And I would argue this is not the first time that architecture has done so. For example, take modernist architecture. We've said a lot of terrible things about modernism, but modernism was able to express the age of the car without becoming a car. The Villa Savoie is definitely has no wheels, but it has a capacity actually to propose a coherent reflection on what it means to live in the mechanized age. So I would argue that probably the fundamental problem of architecture today is to propose a coherent reflection on what it means to live in this strange state of altered real or augmented reality. So architecture must find ways to express the new reality of a matter made both of atoms and bits, and this while relying mainly on atoms. And for me, this is, of course, related also to an inquiry into what we call nature today. Emergence was mentioned by Roland, but I think what is an architecture of the age of emergence, which is not a simple question. So, and above all, what is an architecture of in the age of a computable matter, which is a very fundamental difference with traditional matter. So, of course, we know that digital fabrication is key in that respect, and we've seen a number of examples of that today. We also know, and I found it very interesting that Roland came a number of times around the question of ornament, that actually the ornamental, perhaps certainly not ornament as we knew it, but the ornamental is a question today in relation very often to fabrication. So let me indulge in one of my favorite things, which is to remind that actually materiality is not a fixed thing. Not to deny, materiality is not an entirely natural thing. Of course, you know, when I touch that, this is physical, solid, etc. But I argue that part of what we call materiality involves our relation with the physical world. And it's a relation which is partly determined by culture. I often gave the example of ghosts. In the 19th century, ghosts were for a lot of people much more material than they are today, since you could measure the spiritual aura of ghosts, and there were even photographers of ghosts. We are, of course, con people, but so many people believed that you could take photos of ghosts, that they were more material than today. So somebody this morning talked about touch. To make myself clearer, I wanted to go back to an 18th century philosopher, Condillac, and in his treatise on sensation, in which he has a very weird idea. He imagined some statue who has the possibility to become a subject, but has no sense, etc., and no self-awareness. And Condillac imagined to give the statue successively sight, hearing, etc., etc. And the most determining moment is actually not vision, it's touch. Why touch? Because when you touch something, writes Condillac, you realize there is an external world that resists you, and because of this resistance, you realize that you're someone in the world. So strangely, it resonates with what people like, for example, Damasio today remind us about embodied knowledge, that actually in some ways to become ourselves, we need to be immersed in a physical world through the mediation of the body. And my argument would be to say that when architecture works on how to express this material world, it works actually on this double question, what is the world out there, but who are we as people who experience this world? So that the question for me of the digital reality, the augmented reality, is as much a question about who are we. To give another example, Tadawand, so just, you know, the Condillac, unfortunately, there is no illustration. So I took an illustration for somebody who thought exactly the reverse from Condillac, but seems by, at least in the picture, to express this kind of co-construction, simultaneous emergence of subjectivity and the physical world. So, many architects have written about that. For example, Tadawando, seems to echo Condillac when he explains that actually architecture is about the simultaneous discovery of materials, forms, light, things which are out there, and who we are. And in some ways, this is the same picture as Mario, but for me the real question is actually of course what is out there is important, but who's the person who is looking at it? And I think sometimes architects tend these days to forget that actually the who is architecture meant for is as important about what should architecture be, and is inseparable from it. That actually designing architecture is trying, of course, to find new form, style, whatever, etc. But it's about asking yourself, for whom am I building? And as we know, post-human has been mentioned. There have been a plethora of suggestion of how different we've become in this new world than before. Gregory Bateson was quoted, a number of other people. So just before coming to that, that's for me, by the way, what inhabiting means. Beyond the Heidegger, etc. But actually, you find that in Heidegger. Inhabiting, it's actually relating to a world out there, and simultaneously becoming yourself by relating to it. And I think this is what architecture proposes. In some ways, experiencing the physical world in such a way that it suggests things about who you are. And dwelling, inhabiting, this is what it is about for me. So who are we? We for sure know that we're probably very different from our predecessor. I'm not a post-human fan. I think actually post-human is the latest series of hypotheses about what it means to be human, but clearly, the cyborg has been a possible identity. Among the and there are a lot of things that have been designed in some ways as a kind of improbable home for cyborg thing. Also, something that has been mentioned that Bateson and others, and Bill Mitchell later, have tried to theorize in the architectural realm. How can we be both inhabiting our body and partly outside of our body? And all these questions of distributed subjectivity, etc., are linked to that. How can we design when it becomes really complicated, how can we design for people evidently with bodies, but also living partly out of their bodies? Another Japanese guy, Toyo Ito, famously declared in Tarzan in the Media Forest that we must now design for people who are both within their body of flesh and have an electronic body of some sort. So, and then the latest in the series for me is the kind of distributed self. This is the Facebook network of a Somali teenager girl, sorted by subcategories, social subcategories. But the distributed is not enough, because I think we're both distributed and regrouping. And for me, the age of the distributed self is also the age of the tattoo. And with a tattoo, the reaffirmation of the boundary of our bodies. And by the way, it's quite interesting that the return of the ornamental is also accompanied by a kind of strange generalization of tattoos. So all that to say that who are we is as fundamental a question for architecture than how should we design architecture, because both are inseparable. And once again, I think this is probably the most important question. And I have a good news for you. Normally, I should be able to finish in less than my allotted time, which is relatively common with me. Where do I want to go? To the following. There is actually, once we accept all these premises, if you're ready to follow me, still a fundamental question. What about this computability at work all over the world? If matter, by the end, if the real is defined as the computable, is there any room for something that is not computable? It's a very serious question in cities. For example, today I'm having a lot of heated debate with Carlo and a couple of other friends, as well as with students, because, for example, urban modeling is back. With big data, you have a lot of people following the kind of Santa Fe Institute ideas that think that cities are going to become computable. And we have the beginning of the same trends in architecture. Think of all the people who tell you today, you know what, architect, they do these fancy buildings, but what about neurosciences? After all, we're beginning to know more and more about the way the brain remarks. And you mentioned sensors, etc. You have people who say, let's equip people with sensors, we throw them in the city, and we'll know better how to design urban spaces. And you have at MIT the guy, I'm not arguing that this is what you're doing. I know Christian Old. I'm not arguing, but you have people who translate it in those terms. Just like, this MIT guy who is now generating pictures for the urban, taking samples of people, and looking at the reaction with urban ambiences, etc. So what if architecture was becoming computable? And you have, once again, a number of people who think that architecture should be determined entirely by computation, a computation including how we almost mechanically react to our environment, or to be more sophisticated, let's not use the old modernist metaphor of the mechanical, but cybernetically or whatever, react to our environments. So I think the only antidote, and that will echo also things I've heard this afternoon. I did that on purpose, but it's actually quite striking how things I've heard are a little bit in sync with what I was planning to say, is to be reminded that architecture is political. And we should define probably the political as the thing that disrupts the mechanism of computation. Architecture is political, so let's be clear. How to be political without, we all know that architecture and politics are a complex relation. Stylistically, despite Bruno Zevi's claim that modernist architecture was inherently more democratic, etc., we all know that you can enroll whatever style, mode of composition, etc., for whatever regime. In the 1930s, Speer did neoclassical, and the Americans did neoclassical, and the Soviets did the same. So today, blobs are relatively apolitical. So how to be political? And how to be political is probably to go back to this idea of the physical embodied experience. And I would suggest that probably architecture is not political in the sense of simply, serving a political agenda. What architecture does best, for me, is to create potential, to create situation with a potential for humans to act. So a little bit like, I don't know whether you ever done this experience. You enter an empty theater, there is a stage, and you're just with a couple of friends, and one of them goes on the stage, and what he says or she says becomes different just by the fact that it is on the stage. So I think architecture is a way to frame human action so that they acquire relevance. It does not completely tell you what to say, although a theater strongly suggests you to play or to make dramatic statement, but it does orient human action, but above all suggests that human action has a relevance. So 2 examples about what can architecture do in terms of situation. Very concrete one which is not banal and the other perhaps a bit less dramatic. It's so that was about this idea of architecture as a stage. This is a project for one of my friends at Harvard, Raoul Merotra, and it's nothing dramatic. It's basically a facade, an intelligent facade in the Indian way, and a green facade. Basically, you have people tending a vertical garden. But the real thing that this project is about is inside you have .com people, from the high caste of India, and outside you have almost, the lowest rank of society. And usually they don't see each other. And architecture forces them to see each other. And Raoul told me once that his biggest success was that actually the people who tend the garden dress, because they know that it's one of the few moments in an Indian society who still tend to disregard a lot of people that they're visible. So architecture organizes, for example, to quote another French philosopher, Jacques Rancière, aesthetic regime. That's to say, who can see what, who can be seen by whom in a given society. It seems little, it's actually enormous. Or, in a more benign genre, my friend Ginny Gang, when she does her balcony from which you can see each other in a Chicago tower, usually Chicago high-rise residential housing are about seeing no one from the building. You're each facing the lake and seeing no other person. To be able to see someone else is actually, in the American psyche and high-end condominium, quite a revolution. So all that to say that architecture should perhaps think of itself using materiality, its deep materiality, as a disruptor of the world that some would like to become entirely computable. And on that, with 6 minutes, 5 minutes 57 seconds, I'm done in advance on my time.
So much. It is time for questions now.
Hello. Yeah, it's nice to hear from you, and it's very interesting that you are an historian, engineer, and an architect.
Nobody's perfect.
Yeah. So my question is, yeah, it sets really nicely here. So if we see architecture now, and if we compare with any other industry, let's say last 20 years, other industries have moved forward really fast. There are so many technological advancement. When we started using computation in architecture like 15 years back, but what we see is that still it's in standstill. I mean, most of the buildings are not, still we are making the buildings as we used to do it maybe 50 years back or maybe 100 years back. And when you showed the images of like Google or like Facebook, things have changed drastically. And so my question is that when you say that we have to work in the sync with these changing environment, but we are not doing it. And what do you think in the future?
Well, the first thing, I think, we've heard a lot of things on the fact that architecture is not that backwards by the end. If you take computer uses, I very often say there are more computers in the design school at Harvard than in the physics department. So let's not exaggerate. We're not that backwards. You take experiment on materials, etc. Architects, designers are extremely present. Second, there is something to be said about buildings. Once again, Le Corbusier did not build something that looked like an automobile. So I think we have deeply to accept that architecture may be an endless variation on something like the primitive hut, or I don't know what, but there is something to be said about actually a way to address contemporary issues by not mimicking everything that is around, but trying to go deeper. As I said, for me, the question of who are we today is a question that goes deeper than any kind of stylistic affectation. To take another example, I think materials are evolving very quickly, weather, etc. Digital fabrication, we had a lot of examples. So I would say, I think architecture since Vitruvius, we have inherited from the Western tradition a tradition also of self-flagellation. Do you say that in English? To whip oneself. So architects tend to do that perhaps a bit too much. I would say that engineering has as many difficulties to adapt to this new world. Mario mentioned it, for structural engineering, it's a nightmare, the world we're entering, because it's actually very complicated to develop structural intuition. So we're not the only one to be disrupted.
Sorry. One last point is that most of these innovation in last 20 years, or let's say startups, they are solving a problem, and that's why they are disrupting the industry. But what I see here more and more is that this new architecture is actually end up being in an art exhibitions or,
the pavilion syndrome.
Yeah, but as you said that the art we must build, it should be something which is functional and somebody is going to live there, like living room example you showed, or, so, but more and more we are going away from it.
Yeah, but you have also to accept that architecture to this day, unfortunately, is not only meant for the mass production of ordinary housing, etc. It's a culture with all kinds of people doing very different things. We do very different, Roland and I, and Mario, and between Mario and I, there are a lot of nuances, etc. I think we have to accept also that, even the mass production of architecture feeds in some mysterious way into, this kind of neo-avant-garde or whatever. So we have to accept that it's not, architecture is a field. It's not a narrow discipline. It's a very broad field. It touches also for me on the urban. which is, I did it a bit on purpose, and I was happy that the urban was mentioned a number of times this afternoon, because I think one of the big problem with the digital these days is the dissociation from the urban, strangely. Another big problem for me is the disconnection from environmental issues. For example, I'm always struck by the fact that the first rule of good environmental sustainability should be you shall not glue, thou shalt not glue. And all the wood application, etc., they're based on a massive use of glue to produce the material. So there is a contradiction. Many of the things today are not sustainable in terms of the planet. So there we're having a more serious problem, in my opinion.
Sergejs Nikiforos, Riga, Latvia. All this day we tried to fly, although all the time we were close to the Earth. Close to the Earth. In reality, the subject of the conference is space and digital reality. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are targeting Moon, Mars, and other places in the universe.
Yeah.
Could you drop a couple of words about the subject of the conference, space and digital reality?
Well, I have a tendency to take space in a more everyday life experience. To be honest, space, I'm fascinated by the question of space because I'm actually somebody who is interested in imagination. And the funny thing is that if we look at the technology, we should be in a state of advanced claustrophobia because we have no resources so far to go much beyond Mars. And this is not even sure that we're going to make it. And we have all these Star Wars, etc., which prevent us to become pathetically depressed because of the state of the planet. So I think imagination is both a blessing, etc. Truth is that so far, the space race, if it's going on around the Earth, okay, Elon Musk and others can do it, but Star Wars, unfortunately, except if we discover teletransportation, which I hope we will, but is out of etc. So there is another subject which is actually more interesting in some ways, which is how this imagination of space, but also the concrete technology, have influenced design. That is actually a real issue. But truth is, outer space is actually, we're trapped in a planet a bit larger than Estonia, or France for that matter, but not much larger. So that's the truth. So actually, I believe that the most urgent thing is to make more convergent the quest for environmental quality and the digital. I think that's, for me, the most urgent thing these days. Because usually if you look at School of Architecture, in one corner you have the digital algorithmic people, in another corner you have the sustainable, who may use computer for computer fluid dynamics, but they don't talk much to each other. So, and it seems to me pretty urgent.
Thank you for now. I'm giving word now to Yuri, who is inviting people for a longer discussion.
Thank you very much.